Losing someone to suicide is a tragedy with far-reaching consequences. Next on Speak Your Mind, what all of us can do to reduce the rate of suicide in our communities. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. The rate of suicide in Minnesota is higher than the United States as a whole, and the rate of suicide among active duty military and veterans is higher than the civilian community. That being said, we can all do something to reduce the suicide incidents in our communities, and our guests are here to help explain exactly how we need to go about doing that and what we can do to help. As always, your calls and questions are welcome as we explore this week's topic, so call the numbers on your screen right now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. And you can also email them using the address listed at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. Joining me is Melissa Heinen, the Suicide Prevention Coordinator with the Minnesota Department of Health and suicide loss survivor who has volunteered and worked in suicide prevention for over a decade. And Lindy Fortin is the Suicide Prevention Program Coordinator at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Minneapolis, who's been working in suicide prevention with veterans, their families, and care providers for the past 7 years. Thanks to both of you for driving up here today. I really appreciate that. And I do want to say to our viewing audience that throughout the evening at the bottom of the screen, in addition to the phone numbers that we have where you can call in your questions, we also will have phone numbers for people who might be in an acute crisis, both the National Prevention Suicide Helpline and the Minnesota Crisis Call Line. And so if you're in acute crisis, instead of calling in your questions to us, please call those phone numbers. We think that's really important that you take care of yourself. Now, the first question, and I think I want to have both of you comment on this, is for me, the P word, prevention has always been the P word. It's been a word that me and my colleagues have not liked to use. Not that we don't want to minimize risk. We obviously want to do everything we can to minimize risk for people so that they don't suicide. But the concept of prevention implies that when somebody does suicide, that somebody else has done something wrong. And that's why I've stayed away from the word prevention. But both of you, when I was talking with you, about a month ago about coming on the show, you used it freely. And so I want to hear a little bit about why you don't shy away from that word.
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's a really good question. I've never thought of it as the P word, so it's an interesting concept. To me, I think as a survivor, I am sensitive to that sort of guilt that can be left behind when someone dies by suicide close to you. But I think there's hope with the P word, with prevention. It really, as you think about, some people die of heart disease. It doesn't mean we don't do prevention with heart disease. It doesn't mean our prevention's not effective. And so the way that I've always said it is suicide's preventable most of the time. And I think if we look at it in that lens, then it's not so scary, and it actually makes us aware that there are things we can do to sort of decrease that risk of suicide for people. So that's sort of how I've balanced it, I think.
Lindy, what would you add to that?
You know, I think when we were talking about it over the phone too, you don't know what you don't know. So helping people understand that prevention for suicide is actually possible, and opening the door to conversations and making people aware of things that they didn't know before. That's the prevention part of it. And even with providers, mental health, medical in the hospital, all those, they think they have really good tools, and we hope that they do, but for prevention for suicide, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. So we want to give them those things. We want to have that conversation. We want to empower people to actually, have the conversation, whether they're provider or that patient. And I just think that's really important. So you have to start somewhere. So
I kind of like that concept because it really has challenged my thinking now. It's challenged my thinking, and one of the ways it's challenged my thinking is that, geez, do we work a little harder? Do we have a little bit more hope if we use the word prevention, and do we go maybe an extra mile? Not that I wouldn't go an extra mile, but maybe there's an extra half mile beyond that that I didn't even know was there. If I use the word prevention that way in my own mind, not that I'm an all-powerful, but that it's an aspirational goal. Certainly aspirational to get to zero, even if we can't get to zero.
Right. And I think words have meaning. I mean, words really set the framework for how we see things. And so by bringing that word in and not being afraid to use it or even have the conversation we're having, I think I've seen some survey data in other states where they've asked sort of, do you think suicide's preventable? Do you think you can stop someone if they're thinking of it? Is there any, they can question it so many different ways. And there's cultural differences, both based on your age, based on where you live. And I think, the more we talk about it, maybe there'll be less cultural differences in our state in regards to that. We want people to think that there's something they can do, because there are things they can do to prevent it.
yeah, that's, I think, one of the greatest myths is saying the word suicide rather than prevention. If we go there with it, is giving someone the idea of it, and that has a whole stigma behind it as well, that if we bring it up, they're going to know about it, and then that's my fault. And the whole idea about prevention is, no, this has to be a conversation. We need to know about this. We need to get people of all cultures, all ages talking about this, having information about it, and make it okay.
That notion that if I ask you about suicide, then that will plant the idea into your head, when really what we know is that the person has had the idea in their head, and more likely the thing that happens is that they see, now somebody's willing to talk with me about that, and you open the door to hope and survival then. Let's talk a little, let's get down to some brass tacks and talk a little bit, Melissa. Let's talk a little bit about risk factors, and I'd like for you, you work specifically with the veterans population. Let's talk a little bit about risk factors that maybe you even see more in military personnel and in veterans.
Sure. So some of the noteworthy ones, of course, people talk about having PTSD and anxiety and having trauma experiences, and those of course are not necessarily unique to veterans, but we see that uniquely in them often. Folks that come back with the TBI, a traumatic brain injury, are more susceptible, we believe.
And we know that depression is connected at higher rates to people with a traumatic brain injury, so
Right.
that kind of makes sense that it would go hand in hand.
Right. We know that folks that are at risk for suicide have that depression, have PTSD, have that anxiety, are impulsive, and that all of those things go to a traumatic brain injury. The data used to be, or it used to be thought, that combat is a risk factor, and it is, but that doesn't really show. It shows more 50-50 people that have been in combat, not in combat. So that's a little bit of a myth, but of course the trauma experiences over and over, multiple deployments for active duty, and of course the National Guard here, those are all risk factors. But a lot of the time we see those compounded with risk factors that are just from general population, those things that are stressors in our life, those social situations, relationship issues, those things that cause us stress. So it's the combination of being a veteran and having knowledge of weapons and the trauma experience, coupled with all those other risk factors that make veterans maybe at a higher risk, as we say, than civilians. So.
And talk a little bit about the risk for sort of the civilian or the rest of us,
Yeah.
the rest of us non-military folks.
Yeah. So, I mean, one piece that's been getting a lot more focus and support around is adverse childhood experiences. So
Absolutely.
if you've had an traumatized childhood, and it could be a variety of abuse, physical, emotional, it could be a parent incarcerated, it could be, there's
A parent with substance use, parent with a mental illness, a significant mental illness, right?
Right. So, I mean, everyone can, and there's different ways you can categorize it. Researchers categorize it one way. You as an individual may categorize it as your own trauma. If your mother died of suicide at a young age, that's an adverse childhood experience. So there's a lot that happens in the formative years that can sort of impact people as far as their heightened risk potential for either suicide or substance use or anxiety or those sorts of things. Having said that, there's a lot of protective factors, which I hope we can talk about, that sort of offset the risk factors. Other risk factors, substance use, personal substance use, mental illness is a big piece and sort of a foundational piece when you think about suicide.
Often
risk.
untreated mental illness is really what we're talking about there too, untreated or undertreated.
Yeah, or even unrecognized in the family. No one's really put the pieces together, but really there's something going on there. And then it's sort of the complexity on top of that. There could be life stressors, loss of job, financial insecurity, divorce, it just kind of compounds. You feel sort of overwhelmed by it. And then there can be social things. You could have access to a firearm in your home, that allows for some of that. Or
we know that access to means is a huge risk factor because of the impulsivity connected with suicide, right? That the act of trying to kill oneself is, that's an action that takes place within a few seconds, as opposed to maybe the other things that have been leading up to that.
Right, like if you think about your own constant life turmoil, and then you have sort of thoughts that come in and out of you, right? With whatever it is. If you think of suicide sort of in that same way, you kind of have these thoughts that come, maybe you don't like your job and you think, I want to quit my job, or I want to keep my job, I want to quit. You want to leave the situation, right? So that's sort of, it's just this pain and this wanting to find hope and not feeling hope and feeling like a burden and not knowing the way out. So when you said, if we can talk about it, can we open the door? If I feel that way and someone says to me, sometimes when people's life gets like this, they think about suicide. Have you thought about killing yourself? Oh my gosh, I just got chills. You just opened the door for me to now feel like it's okay to talk to you about it, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And the ins and outs of all those things and the feelings, and sometimes people feel suicidal and sometimes they don't, and they have good coping and then they don't. But the act of suicide is very impulsive. It happens right then at that, oh my goodness, I can't get past this, rather than one of those other ebbs of, oh yeah, this is, it's going to be okay. And not to minimize, but that's how it goes. But we do associate, suicide's very impulsive. It's an anxious thing. It happens suddenly, even though there is that thinking often on about it. So.
And just so I can take it, and that's the reason why access to lethal means, and so if you have someone that's in a crisis, if you remove medication from the home or a firearm, or set the keys aside and give it to the brother-in-law or something during this time of heightened concern for someone, that maybe even get them through that time period, then they can find someone to help them and some hope, and you sort of decrease the likelihood.
The prevention we've steered talking about is that what I call when I teach prevention on the bridge. Suicide prevention on the bridge is that immediate crisis. Somebody intervenes and you're less likely to actually attempt and have that behavior. But there's also suicide prevention that happens way back here with the mental health treatment and those things that we were talking about, and recognizing warning signs and being able to talk about it way before it becomes crisis and all of those things. So there's so many different levels.
Because we know actually that people have often had a long period of having suicidal thoughts before they take any action, and there are many people who have suicidal thoughts or morbid thoughts that they wish that they weren't alive, and who never plan on killing themselves, and they won't attempt suicide, and they're pretty safe often because of the protective factors that they have. But I think it's important to say too, right, that on the one hand, just thinking about suicide doesn't mean that you're going to attempt. but it's a great place to intervene.
Oh, absolutely. Most people who think about wanting to end their life don't. Most people who think about suicide do not die by suicide. They find help, they find hope, they find connectedness. So when we talk about protective factors, a big part of that is connectedness. Connectedness, if you're a youth with your family and older adults, school, if you're an older person, your workplace, your friends that you go play baseball on the weekend with, some sort of civic connection, right? If you feel connected to something, you don't feel all alone, you feel like that matters, that is a huge protective factor. So even when the world seems like it's tumbling down on you, if you have that connectedness, that is a huge protective factor for people.
It's connectedness and purpose. You have something to do, something to look forward to, people that keep you going, or something or other, all of those things intertwined.
That having a life worth living, right, and creating a life worth living if you don't feel like you have that for yourself right now. Now there's a question, and I think this is a really important question to ask, about how many people attempt and do it just for the sake of getting attention. And I think we need to address that, because that's often, for me also, that feels like another one of the big myths out there associated with suicide, that bystanders or family members or friends think like this is a person just being overly dramatic and doing this for attention. What would you say about to that?
You know, I think that it takes a lot to overcome our brains to be able to harm ourselves. And the ability to attempt suicide may seem to those on the outside as attention, but I think that it goes to really needing help. Whether you actually know that or can say it or any of those things, there's really something going on. Something horrible has happened to you in some way, shape, or form, and you really need help, and you don't know how to ask for that, you don't know where to get it or any of those things. I really think that it's legitimate when people act out extreme, like to try to take their life. It's very extreme, and I think that it's very serious.
I think if this is the only way that you can communicate the pain that you're in, and that is seen by others as attention getting, but this is the only way that you have been able to get across to other people, I am in such great despair, and that's the only tool that you have in your toolbox, then that's the tool you're going to use. But holy mackerel, we want to help you get a few more tools in that toolbox and learn how to communicate.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. Yeah.
And I think what I sort of hope for people when we say everyone has a role in prevention is not that they have to work this person through their process, you know, from the beginning to the end. It's to identify and care and connect them. And leave it up to the mental health professional to sort of figure out the severity, the potential risks there. But regardless, they need some supports, and they need some supports more than they're getting if they're doing this.
Well,
so
here's a question. Here's a question that you can help somebody with, and because it just gets at what you were saying, Melissa. How do you approach someone who may be thinking about suicide? What would be a way for me to be helpful to that person instead of making things worse?
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. I think people are always worried they're going to send them over the edge. Okay.
Yeah,
right.
We said that's one thing.
So two things that I have. If you just really know someone's down on their luck and you're concerned about them, you can sort of say, invite them to coffee if that's something you normally do. Do something that's normal for you, right? And then sort of just be frank with them and say, I can't believe everything on your plate right now. How are you handling it? And sort of feel what they say, really listen, and be comfortable with silence for a while. And then sort of, if you are concerned, say, it sounds like you got a lot on your plate. Sometimes when people get really overwhelmed like this, they just feel like they can't do it anymore, and they feel like they want to give up, and they might even think they want to kill themselves. Have you ever thought about killing yourself? And then if they say yes, then you need to be willing to sit with that with them and not go, oh, did you see the football? But then walk it through and then say, this is something that, because I care about you, I feel I need to really take this serious. This is serious. Can we connect you with someone? And that's where you really want to know your resources before you go in there. 1-800-273-TALK. You can call on behalf of someone. You do not have to be the person struggling. So that's an example where you really know. Now, if someone's like going to visits with a therapist, and you want to support them because they're trying to get support for their.
As a therapist, I love that.
Okay, yes.
I love that
Yeah.
when somebody comes and said, I just had to bring my friend with me, and I'll say, do you mind if your friend comes into the office? And I also always say to families and friends, you know, sometimes if we don't have a release in information, I can't share information, but you can always leave me information. If you're concerned about somebody and you're concerned that I may not have the information that you think I need to be the most helpful.
Yeah. I think we talked to a lot of family. Just today, we had a young kid come talk to us and say, you know, how do you approach? How do you start this conversation? How do I get my friend help, because I know he needs something? And I say, well, you need to see if you're comfortable with it and sit with it for a second. And if you decide that you are, then you have to do something. And that can be having that first conversation and really asking them questions. Tell them that you've been paying attention and you know they have stuff going on, you know. Or, you know what, if you can't have that conversation, you need to approach them that you know they need something's going on and you don't know what it is, but you want to help get them to that other person. You know, let me go with you.
I love that. I love the idea that even if you're not comfortable sitting with the questions, of find somebody who maybe is and bring them into the conversation with you. Let's get to Melissa. Let's get to some protective factors, because I'm afraid we're going to run out of time, and that's really important to know.
It's really important.
That sense that we can have resilience within us before the bad things happen.
Absolutely. So my big thing with suicide prevention, it doesn't even need suicide in the name, right? Basic, taking care of your health, getting adequate sleep, eating well, exercising. So that basic taking care of yourself is a protective factor.
And we always come back to that on this show. We always come back to this. Sleep, eat right, don't be drinking too much alcohol and drugs out there, and get some exercise. Those are, you know, they're the foundations of life, and they're the foundations of well-being, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. So that's a huge piece, right?
Right.
And then having a social connectedness, that is fun, whether it's church every Sunday and you go to coffee afterwards, a baseball game, that piece is critical. Feeling like you have a safe connection, safe house, safe community is critical. Having employment or meaningful work.
That purpose.
Yeah,
the connectedness, the purpose. A lot of times we have guys or gals come and say, you know, it's just that significant other, that one other person, you know, that confidant, or that thing, that job, or that child, or, you know, and it's not necessarily one thing, but, you know, we sometimes live for, you know, the things around us and with us and our family and those types of things. So if you keep that.
I know that the VA system and the military system and the vet system has done a lot of work to get veterans connected to veterans, and part of, you know, the helplines that are out there available in a veteran-to-veteran peer support model, which I think is also, I think that's wonderful for the community in general, but especially for more specific populations who have sometimes really good reason to believe of, you don't understand me. And tell me a little bit about that.
We hear that a lot from guys, that you can't understand what I've seen, you can't understand what I've been through, there's no way. I always say, well, if you tell me, I will. However, you know what? I can hook you up with another veteran. We have peers, we have providers that are veterans. It just works. I think that works in the school system, you know, with kids that have training for awareness. But yeah, with us, we have specific peer support people that, you know, sit down and are trained and can do suicide awareness along with just peer support. You know, I'm here for you, that type of design. It's all over,
And I think we can be peer support, you know, just there's someone you know who has a hard time getting out of their home, if it's like a relative or is older or something, call them up and invite them out for coffee. Those little things.
Your neighbor.
Can make a huge difference.
Your neighbor.
Community.
Like, get to know your neighbors, right? So that you build a community. That's part of what you're talking about, is that is that notion of get out of your house and build a neighborhood, be part of your neighborhood, be an active part of your own community, because then you're building those connections in that way. We're coming to the end of the show already. So what's the parting message that you would like to leave us with, Lindy?
Oh goodness. If you or someone you know, someone you love, needs help, reach out. Even if it's anonymous, call the crisis line, call the suicide hotline, the 1-800-273-8255. Just start. Just reach out and give it a try before you make any decisions. Somebody wants to listen, somebody can listen, and somebody will be able to help.
And on that note, thank you so much for both of you for joining us, and thank you for joining the discussion this week. And don't forget that I think the big thing that we learned this week was that we should use the word prevention. There is absolutely reason to be hopeful, even in the middle of your despair. Help is available and help matters. Don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links, and read my blog, the place where I will answer more of your questions. You can also email us your questions about next week's show, when we'll be talking about maternal mental health. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.